다음에 저희한테 말씀을 들려주실 분은 가스파 신부님이신데요. 이분은 보시면 아시겠지만 스페인 빌바오 교구의 교구 신부님입니다. 그리고 빌바오에 있는 데스토 대학에서 신학을 가르치고 있는 분이고요. 국제 가톨릭 문화 지식인 운동이라고 박스-로마나 이크미카, 우린 이크미카라고 흔히 부르는데 저희 우리 신화연구소가 거의 거기에 속해 있습니다. 하나의 회원 단체로 가입돼 있죠. 거기 전 지도신부님이셨습니다. 그래서 제가 부탁드리기를 서구 신학자의 눈에서 과연 아시아 신학이라는 게 그동안 어떠한 평가를 받을 수 있는지 평가를 좀 해주십시오, 이렇게 부탁을 드렸고요. 오시는 날까지도 저한테 어떤 거를 하실지 저희한테 이 선생님 논문을 주시지 않았어요, 강의록을. 그리고 오늘 아침 9시에 저한테 9시 27분에 보냈습니다. 그래서 제가 못 받고 여러분들이 직접 받으셨어요. 그래서 통역하시는 분들한테는 꽤 죄송스럽게 제가 나중에 전달을 해드렸고요. 그런데 제가 신부님께 감사드리는 거는 1시간밖에 어제 못 주무시고 오늘 아침에 그거를 끝내셨답니다. 그래서 더 이상 할 말이 없어서 이렇게 너무 어려운 주제에서 사실은 이게 무리한 주제를 부탁드렸는데 그걸 잘 맞춰주시고 저희한테 좋은 말씀을 들려주신 가스파 신부님 모시겠습니다. 큰 박수 부탁드리겠습니다.
안녕하세요. I feel quite unequipped to come today in front of you. So you shouldn't expect me to share my wisdom with you. Rather, on the one hand, my almost total ignorance about Asian reality, but also at the same time I hope, my thanks and my excitement for being here among you and for having the opportunity to learn from you. Whenever in the course of the last 2 days I looked out of the window of the room I have been staying in, I saw at a very close distance the Yeoldu-san Martyrs Shrine, where about 8,000 Catholics, almost all of them native Koreans, were beheaded during the 1866 Beonin persecution. From 1791 until that 1866 fateful year, about 10,000 Korean Catholics, mostly lay people, were martyred. Christianity in Korea is a curious case study for 2 reasons. First, because it was voluntarily brought into the country by lay native Koreans who yearned for a truth that they found in the gospel that was being preached in nearby China. Secondly, because for many years it was preached and nurtured by lay people, now and then being ministered by 1 or 2 priests who occasionally would come from China. Now, every 20th of September, we celebrate the memory of those martyrs, thus calling to our minds not only as Tertullian said, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the Church, but also that the Holy Spirit decreed that the good news should be heard first in Korea through the mouths of lay Koreans. No wonder Christians in Korea represent more than 30% of the population, and Catholics, although only about 10% of that population, make up 1/3 of the parliament members. I'm not bringing all this to your attention in order to glorify the Catholic Church of Korea. Those of you who, unlike me, are Koreans, know and often say that a church so ingrained in Korean society with great social prestige is not free from contradictions and ambiguities. At the same time, though, as the last development in Jeju Islands prove, Catholics in Korea continue to play a prophetic role in this society. Coming from the land of St. Ignatius, St. Francis Xavier, and St. Valentin de Bergochoa, bishop of one of the rural vicarates in Vietnam, martyred in 1861, I have met many Basque missionaries, priests, and religious, male and female, in my field trips to Asia and elsewhere. Wherever I have been to, I have found Basque missionaries, including the Franciscans here in Seoul, one of whose houses downtown was founded by them. One of the things that have shocked me most when talking to them is that while always proudly retaining their Basque roots, first, they invariably feel they belong to the countries where they live and work. Secondly, they have been living here for many years, so that theirs is a lifelong commitment to their missionary work. Thirdly, most of them are working with and for poor people, regardless their faith, in some cases trying desperately to preserve their most basic human rights. Fourthly, they sense that their mission asks them to relate in a positive way to adherents of other religious traditions. Finally, almost all of them are in their 70s or 80s, since, as you may know, vocations to the priesthood and the consecrated life are dwindling very fast in my country and in Western Europe at large. Our local church has always felt blessed with this missionary activity, since it is much more what we have received and learned than what we have given and taught. Is this not a proof of the evangelizing power of the poor? On a different note, let me tell you that we Basques were a rather poor people for many centuries, and therefore have a long history of migrating to other countries, mostly to North and South America. Nowadays, our people also migrate, but for quite different reasons. At present, the Basque country is doing quite well economically speaking, and our companies send qualified people to other countries all over the world to open new markets and to set up new factories and operating bases. One can find Basque centers in most business cities, all the way from Tokyo to Melbourne, through Shanghai, Hong Kong, Singapore, Brussels, Buenos Aires, Mexico City, New York, and San Francisco. The reasons for telling you all these things are the following. First, we all are migrants of one kind or the other. That is to say, mobility and change are permanent traits of both humankind and every human culture. Most civilizations and even human species pass away. It is just a question of time. Thus, the Neanderthal disappeared from Europe when the Cro-Magnon or Homo sapiens sapiens came to Europe from its African cradle. Just to mention the end of the evolutionary human species process chain. But in order to last before such radical changes happen, cultures and civilizations must constantly adapt themselves by properly responding to the ceaseless influences they are exposed to over time. In this respect, they can be likened to the individual person, always the same, and at the same time always different until it dies. Since there is no culture without religion, and no religion without culture, being both intrinsically intertwined, Also, religions are subject to change, both in terms of their territorial boundaries, their conceptualization and expressions, and their self-understanding. Moreover, one can see that the way religions come into existence is related to pre-existing religions. Thus, Buddhism came out of Hinduism. Judaism came out of the Mesopotamian religion. Christianity came out of Judaism, and Islam came out of both Judaism and Christianity. Since all these new inceptions were rather traumatic, the conflictive breaking apart from the previous religion shows up even at the level of the sacred text or sacred memories, something one must never forget when trying to foster interreligious dialogue. One thinks here of the Gospel of St. Matthew, St. John, letters of Paul, where one can sense this conflict, and sometimes a very open and very strong conflict with the synagogue and Judaism. How to overcome that? It has become to be a sacred memory. Interaction among cultures and among religions is a necessary condition for the vitality and survival, no matter how asymmetrical and sometimes lethal that interaction is. If frozen in time or space, they die. At the same time, one must realize that there is no dialogical ideal situation for a communicative action between and among religions and cultures. Hence the call for humility, patience, self-restraint, and most of all, honesty to oneself and to the others. Despite all our goodwill and efforts, fact is that at any table of dialogue there is either an overt or a covert hierarchy of power that plays a subliminal role difficult to avoid. There have been different ways of sharing and spreading the good news, following the mandate of Jesus the Christ. Whereas in many instances Christian missionary activity has been part of colonization, clear departures or totally different ways of conducting it have occurred in history, as for example the aforesaid Korean case study, or the active denouncing and opposition to natives' exploitation in the case of the Dominican fathers Montesinos and Las Casas. Las Casas said, "I prefer a pagan Indian alive than a Christian Indian dead." They brought about important changes in regulations, both civil and ecclesiastical. Another example, the Jesuit reducciones in Paraguay. As in the case of Basque missionaries, the number of Catholic missionaries belonging to traditional religious orders, congregations, and missionary societies from affluent European countries and from the US is also rapidly dwindling. In this respect, some developments are taking place. A. Wealthy Catholic churches and agencies financially support local churches in the poor countries where once they themselves conducted their missionary work, as well as missionary activities conducted by other people. Missionaries don't come, but the money keeps flowing. The so-called new movements and communities in the Catholic Church are undertaking a new missionary effort not linked with local churches in the West. Very recently, the founder of the neo-catechumenal movement, the Spaniard Kiko, announced plans for sending 2,000 missionaries, mostly lay, to China. C. Non-Catholic Christian missions, especially those of Pentecostal and evangelical nature, are flourishing. Only in Korea, the number of such missionaries is said to be in the 10,000+. Non-European Christian churches and movements, both Pentecostal and evangelical, are already by some counts a 25% of total Christians in the world, and they are supposed to grow very rapidly over the next 30 years. As I mentioned to you, my country has deeply changed over the last 150 years, from scarcity to affluence, by means of industrialization, sustained educational programs, innovation, and growing access to foreign markets. But the case of my country is by no means unique. Even more dramatic in the same direction has been the case of Korea, not to mention post-war Japan, and the other so-called Asian miracles, among which the Tigers and more recently the BRICS are paramount. From this standpoint, Asia is already looked upon as the new world-leading continent to be in a relatively few decades. I also told you that one can find Basque centers in the main business cities all over the world. Such a privilege was reserved to the very few colonial powers until recent times, whereas the development of globalization, by compressing both time and space, mainly through IT, this is information technology, gives many, but not the destitute, of course, the possibility of interacting instantly in a vast array of matters. This opens the door for everybody to be everywhere. A development whose many faceted consequences are far-reaching and not easy to fathom. You may not know that my country is a very small one, with a 3 million total population, something you may laugh at from the viewpoint of your highly populated countries and cities. My whole country only would account for less than 15% of the population of some cities in Asia. Yet, it has made its voice to be heard in a way that is not proportional to its size. This is just a metaphor of another important current development taking place. All the others of history, the little ones, the ignored, whose voice has been silenced until now by the elitist standards of modernity, are those who have benefited most from it, are coming to the fore, asking for the right to take their share of center stage. Indigenous peoples, women, traditional cultures and religions, gays, lesbians, outcasts, and a long etc. that includes very prominently nature itself, foolishly exploited and abused since industrialization and blind progress showed up disguised as the new saving forces of humankind. The Korean martyrs case with which I have opened my presentation reminds us of the painful existence nowadays of many such cases of religious persecutions, crimes, and murders across the continent. Granted, Asia is not the only continent in which such perversions take place. Religious persecution and discrimination are present everywhere in more crude or mitigated forms. Such recurrent cases must be seriously taken into account lest we deceive ourselves and any dialogue talk becomes shallow and void of true content. The former point brings me to the final one of this initial part of the presentation. Globalization is coupled with a growing fear on the part of those who rightly suspect that might be the losers of this new power game. Thus, identity, self-affirmation, negation of the other, and too often hatred fostered by political manipulation have resulted in a new latent Cold War that erupts now and then with a tremendous destructive power of both bodies and minds. New forms of cultural and religious hatred are showing up everywhere, sometimes in an explicit manner and much too often in a disguised one. In this first part, in which I will try to analyze Asia and the task of theology from the 60s to 2000, I will do that trying to establish a dialogue with Europe and America. Allow me to put forward some of my views concerning the dramatic changes theology underwent from the 50s to the 80s in Europe, Latin America, and the US before entering the Asian theological soil. I consider Runner a turning point in Catholic theology. His theology, together with the theology of other crucial authors on the eve of the Council, Congar, Danielou, de Lubac, and Chenu, among others, shaped the theology of Vatican II and paved the way for a fruitful dialogue between modernity and Catholic theology, and most of all, for opening the gates of grace, making it both original, creation as God's own self-communication, and universal, present always and everywhere. Runner's theology has produced, in my view, excellent fruits in the work of many theologians, but more precisely in the work of three theologians who have developed their own theological projects in three different cultural and social contexts. Johann Baptist Metz in Germany, Gustavo Gutierrez in Peru, and David Tracy in the United States. Metz is widely considered the founder of political theology. Gutierrez fathered liberation theology in the late 60s and has been since then one of its main proponents. Tracy, in turn, represents the best effort at shaping a public theology in the US from a Catholic perspective. There is an important commonality among these three post-Runnerian theological enterprises. Each project can be clearly traced to Runner and maintains a fruitful relationship with Runner's theology throughout its development. However, unlike Runner's theology, each of them is directly related to the concrete culture and society in which it is born and with which it seeks to establish a fruitful and critical dialogue on strictly Christian theological grounds. In this respect, all three of them replace Runner's transcendental approach with a more historical and concrete one, thus issuing in three different contextual theologies. Like Aquinas in his time, Runner was criticized for being too anthropological and consequently for risking the dissolution of the religious substance of Christian theology. This critique has been also addressed to the three aforesaid authors. However, always in my view, far from getting theologically lost, these authors intensify their theological core. Unlike Runner, each one of them finds his own route to the mystery of God on the basis of his own theological approach. Let me elaborate some more on this summary. The three models of post-Runnerian theology follow the double movement of exitus reditus in relation to Runner's theology. They exit transcendentality and move to history and society in order to place the discussion on God not at the preemptive level of the transcendental analysis of the conditions of possibility of knowing and being, but at the level of the conditions of history and the experiences of non-identity found in that history. Having done that, the three theologies retrieve the hiddenness and the incomprehensibility of God, thus coming back in a kind of recapitulatory way, each through its own theological journey and its own terms, to the mystery of God in which Runner himself recapitulated his theological enterprise. The post-Runnerian theologians move from historicity as existential dimension to the concreteness of history, from the abstract Runnerian subject to the concrete subjects and non-subjects in particular societies and cultures, and from the transcendental identity found in the original experience to the concrete experiences of non-identity found in those particular history, societies, and cultures. Let me skip some of this part. I'm going to jump up to page number 9, second paragraph. Coming back to Asia, I can see that despite clear differences and features specific to the Asian context, there are some similarities between the three theological models I just outlined and some of the theological enterprises that have been developed in Asia. Probably the most important similarity lies in the contextualization of the theological endeavor. Asian authors like Metz, Gutierrez, and Tracy are neither school-oriented nor do they theologize from principles down. Rather, they try to develop the theological task taking into account the real situation of the societies and peoples in which they pursue their work, interacting with the different players and voices, while at the same time living out their faith in a manner that coheres with the salvation and healing that Jesus brought to his own people. It is clear to me that most Asian theologians have established a close and meaningful dialogue with liberation theology, and like the latter, have developed a new spirituality of their own that parallels Gutierrez' "we drink from our own well." In fact, spirituality and theology go hand in hand in any theology worth such a name, but is paramount in the case of both liberation theology and Asian theologies. Another interesting similarity is that liberation theologians work closely with the bishops that in Medellin, Puebla, and Santo Domingo pursued the task of inculturating Vatican II in the both massively Catholic and poor Latin American context. Likewise, it seems to me that Asian theologians have helped their bishops to inculturate Vatican II in the both religiously pluralistic and massively poor Asian context. This can clearly be seen in the proceedings of the multifaceted FABC activities and gatherings. Common to the three post-Ranerian contextual theologians is their unmasking of modernity. Let me jump again. To page 10, second paragraph. I would like to finish this part of my presentation with what I consider to be a crucial point concerning the understanding of the Church and the role of local churches in enriching the common depositum fidei. One could say that if local churches do not accrue to this common body of doctrine, then something is possibly wrong inside the Church. If inculturation means something, is the capacity of a given local church to unveil a central aspect of Jesus' message of salvation that is relevant for the whole church and is accepted by it. When that happens, one has proof of the inculturation of the gospel in that particular church. That is exactly what happened with the option for the poor, later qualified as preferential option for the poor. Liberation theology tried to render Vatican II meaningful for the Latin American churches by showing both its achievements and its shortcomings. In so doing, it reflected theologically on the basis of its own context and concluded that God had opted for the poor and that the Church had to do the same. This important conclusion, after being refined, came to be assumed by church authorities and came to be affirmed in papal documents, thus becoming an integral part of the depositum fidei. Asian theologians and bishops have been affirming for many years now that theology reflecting on the life of the Church and taking into account the Asian context had to be developed through a threefold dialogue with the poor, with the cultures, and with the religions present in Asia. All the relevant traditions, in fact. By saying so, they were affirming that dialogue and mission could neither go different ways nor separate from each other. Perhaps, by today's standards, this may look obvious, but it was put forward was a dramatic departure from previous positions and changed completely the rules of the mission game. This has been accepted and affirmed in papal documents, thus becoming part of the common depositum. This apparently small achievement proves that the Asian Church efforts to enculturate the gospel in Asia has already borne an important fruit that it shares with the rest of the Church. Finally, some tasks looking ahead. I will come back now to some of the issues I pointed out in my introduction. Some of them deserve, in my opinion, further reflection and elaboration by Asian theologians. One question is which role can be played by Christianity in Asia, bearing in mind that in most areas it was brought by foreign missionaries and that because of it, it is still considered a religion not only foreign, but with a certain colonizing flavor. Recall that I pointed to the Korean exception, because in this case Christianity was brought and preached by Korean lay people. Let me tell you that I take it for granted that Christianity has already been playing an important role in Asia. My question has to do with three issues that I think to be of vital importance for the self-understanding of Christianity. First, if, as Pierre says, the metacosmic religions had already offered the cosmic ones the response that they needed, and they were in one way or the other looking after, then what is the purpose of another metacosmic religion coming into the scene other than compete with the incumbent one? I have no answer for this question. How does this relate to Jesus' missionary mandate? Which role has the Holy Spirit played in the missionary endeavor of the Catholic Church in China and in Asia as a whole? Concerning these issues, I tend spontaneously to agree with Pierre's own answer in the sense that the agapic character of Christianity is a necessary complement to the Gnostic character of the most important Asian religious tradition. But I still think that these matters need more theological elaboration. I also mentioned that the relationship between religions can be originally conflictive, even at the level of the sacred founding texts or written memories. How then must interreligious dialogue be conducted, and how can we overcome the barrier of conflicting sacred memories? Even if we share the most basic dialogue of life, and even this possibility cannot be taken for granted, how far can we advance in sharing our religious and spiritual insights and riches with one another? Another question in need of further elaboration is the changing nature of religion as manifested by current developments in Hinduism, Christianity, and Islam, and the relationship of those changes with the process of globalization. Among such new developments, one must mention the search for a clear-cut identity, a thirst for self-affirmation, even in aggressive ways, the urge for community and belonging, and the growing importance of feeling and experience of a reason, and even at its expense. How are we going to deal with these ambiguous changes that might threaten our desire for mutuality and dialogue? How is the Catholic Church in Asia going to respond to the challenge? Are we paying enough attention to the importance of Islam in Asian countries, to its global importance, and to the dialogue with its many families? I also mentioned the two interrelated facts of fast economic growth in key Asian countries, among which India and China are the most prominent, and of globalization. This again is changing the face of Asia and poses a tremendous challenge both to the agapic and Gnostic religions. How, in other words, are religions to share the basic tenet of the need for being freed both from need and from want, when most people are just looking for the best opportunities for benefiting from the current economic boom? I could go on and on, but I would like to close with one more question. It is a common complaint, mostly in Asia, but also elsewhere, that Catholic theology, despite all the crucial changes brought about by Vatican II, the subsequent papal documents and the synods held in Rome, continues to be too Greco-Roman and too anchored in traditional theological frameworks from which either for some cannot and should not free itself, and for others is not allowed to break free. This is not to say that Catholics continue to see themselves and others as before those doctrinal developments. Prior to them, it is all too obvious that extra ecclesiam nulla salus was to be taken literally. At the same time, since truth and error cannot have the same rights, the Catholic Church, that had to put up with tolerance after the Peace of Westphalia, could not bring itself to admit that freedom of conscience entailed religious freedom. Wherever the Roman Catholic Church had the power to do so, it blocked the possibility of freely choosing one's religion in many countries. The idea for the Roman Catholic Church then was the Roman Catholic confessional state, where no other religion or denomination could legally exist. From those tenets and practices to the current position of the Church in these matters, much has changed. One might think that such practices would have been impossible to keep in today's societies, but beyond that, the Church has found a way to admit in its own theological, fully coherent and cogent way that A, salvation is not materially linked with being a member of the Church. B, freedom of conscience and religious freedom are interrelated and are sacred. C, God is the only one who saves in God's own terms. D, the Holy Spirit finds the way to save in and through Jesus Christ all those who are true and honest members of other confessions and religions, which in turn contain certain means of salvation even beyond the merely seminal ones. In other words, the Church has found a way to come to terms with religious freedom and salvation for those who are not Christian, but inside itself. That is to say, without breaking the central tenet of Jesus the Christ being the unique mediator of all salvation. This development is by no means negligible. However, many Asian theologians find this terribly unsatisfying. Granted that the Church has found a way inside its own gates, but what about those who are outside those gates? The response of the Church is clear. By means inscrutable both for them and for the Church itself, they are not out, but in, even if nobody knows it. No wonder adherents to other religions find this unsatisfactory, at least, if not totally offensive. It seems to me that Asian theology has been pointing to the need for a more pluralistic and equally footed way of understanding the salvific role of religions as a result of God's own salvific design. It seems to me, too, that in a way that I cannot devise, therein lies the promise of a new theological breakthrough that could give a new impulse to Christianity that would enable it to respond with renewed strength to the challenges of an ever-changing world much in need of wisdom, justice, and peace. 감사합니다.